Welcome as we continue our summer series reading through the book of Genesis. This week we're focusing on Genesis 6 through 9. These chapters begin telling us the story about Noah and his family and God's promise to them. We continue to encourage you as you practice faith and share faith at home to use the Faith Five, either as a journaling activity if you're doing this by yourself, or as a way to connect with others who you're either living with or sharing this with over social media or Zoom or FaceTime or however you're talking with people these days. Share a bit about what's going on in your life, to read the Bible story or key passage together, to talk about it, to pray for one another in the world, to make the sign of the cross and bless one another. We're moving into the story of Noah and his family in Genesis chapter 6 to 9. If you grew up in a church, some of these stories may be very familiar to you. The story of Noah and Noah's Ark is a very popular story with children. But as an adult, I think there's a lot of nuance in these chapters that perhaps we don't get into when we are younger and growing up and just trying to get the overall feel of the story. In Genesis chapter 6, Noah receives instructions from God to build an ark. But if you read closely, we hear that something in the world is causing God to grieve. And I lift that up for you to check that out and to reflect on that, about what's happening and God's response to it. In chapter 7, we get to the part that's known as the flood. It rains for 40 days and 40 nights, and rain covers the earth. I think as we read this in the Bible, every time I read it, I notice something a little bit different. Something else stands out to me. So I just simply ask you to consider, what did you notice in the story of the flood that you had not noticed before this reading of it as you read through Genesis chapter 7 this week? In chapter 8, we hear of God's promise. At the very end of chapter 8, God's promise to Noah and to his family. One of the fascinating parts about promises, whether they are between God and people or between people here among us, is, does our promise that we make in any way restrain or limit future actions we might take so that we don't violate the promise that we have made or the covenant that we have made with other people? In our lives, I think that is entirely true, but perhaps not. So when we make promises, does it limit our future actions and our options? And could that be a good thing and healthy? Or does it restrain us in a way that is overly restrictive? Does God limit God's future options in these verses? I think that's something that's worthy of our discussion and care with one another as you read through this chapter. In chapter 9, we see a fuller version of the covenant that God makes with Noah. And one of the pieces that you notice in chapter 9 is that God makes the covenant with all creatures, not just all people, but all creatures. And I can't help but wonder that God is willing to covenant with all creatures, how that impacts our life and the way we relate to the natural world. That God is committed not only to humans, but to animals, but to plants, and for the well-being of all that God created back in the beginning of Genesis. And if God is committed to the well-being of the whole world and all that is created, including non-human creatures, what does that mean for our responsibility for the environment, for the world, and for the other creatures that God has made? I invite you to reflect and discuss that among your friends and family this week as you study this part of the Genesis. When you're through, I encourage you to pray for people in your family and your household, and for the people and the relationships we form with one another, and for all of God's creation in this world. And as you conclude, it's important for us to learn to say a word of blessing to one another. Not only about a word of blessing about what we want, what we are asking God to do in our lives each day. I hope you continue with us this summer as we journey through Genesis and reading it together as a congregation. And may the peace of the Lord be with you this day.